Afternoon, everybody. Well, not quite yet, right? It's only quarter to 12. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Cheryl Ann Notary. That's what it says on my business card. Oh, Sharon says she can't hear me, so I'm going to speak up. Um, and I am a clinical psychologist. I teach part-time at Montclair State University, master's and doctoral students in counseling. I have a private practice in Summit, New Jersey, where I see children, teenagers, young adults, adults, couples, and families. One of the courses I teach at Montclair is couples, marriage, and family counseling, which is why I'm here today. I'm not going to teach you the whole course, I promise. That's pretty boring. Um, you're getting what I like to call, for us older folks, the Cliff Notes version. For you younger folks, the Sparks Notes version of transgenerational systems therapy, family therapy. So, to start, this is a theory put forth by Murray Bowen. Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist working from 1946 to about 1959. Actually, that's a little cheat for him. It's actually a little later because he goes on to be a professor at Georgetown University, where he did quite a lot of work around case studies of families. During this early period, he was at the Menninger Clinic from about 1946 to, I think it was, don't quote me on this, but 1952 maybe. And during that time, the Menninger Clinic and the National Institute of Mental Health, which he goes on to work there, were working diligently to try to understand schizophrenia. As part of their work, they started working with families there and to try to understand how the families contributed to the schizophrenic makeup. And what they didn't know at the time, which we do now know, is that it's hereditary. So they were actually onto something, just from a different point of view. They were thinking that it had a lot to do with the emotional environment that somebody was raised in. We now know that that emotional environment can be a trigger for the symptoms of schizophrenia. And again, they weren't incredibly wrong. What we now know is that about 1% of people who are, of the general population, are schizophrenic. In that population of people who are schizophrenic, they usually have at least one first or second degree relative who is also schizophrenic. So we know that there is some sort of genetic pathway that makes this happen. Unfortunately, we are not at the point where we can isolate genes to say, okay, this is it. It's very much similar to what we now know about autism. We know it runs in families. We can't figure out where that genetic link is, but we do know one very important thing, and largely because of his work, is that emotional environment is what makes things harder for folks that fall in these categories. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what he was thinking. And remember, a lot of what he was thinking took place before we had any understanding of genetics. Oh, yeah. No, it's okay. So I gave you two pieces of paper. One which is fun because it has all sorts of symbols on it, one that's not so fun because it has a lot of words. And so I'm going to start with the one that's not so fun and a lot of words, because this is his understanding of the concepts of what was important in a family structure that allowed these symptoms to emerge. Now, as a modern day family therapist, we now know that he wasn't far off on a lot of these things. In fact, some of them are very accurate. And he takes what we call a microscopic view and then pulls it out to a magnified global view of why symptoms occur. And his idea was that these interactions within families could be understood within a multi-generational context. That was a big shift because up to this point, most people were thinking, well, it's the nuclear family that matters. And whatever happens in that family, that's what creates dysfunction. And he said, wait a minute, I think we can track this back further. And he was the first one to say, all right, let's zoom out a little bit and see what happened in generations before. And if we can't predict what might take place based on those previous generations. He wasn't wrong, by the way. It's called generational transmission of dysfunction. And he started with 8 key concepts, which I gave you a handout of, so you don't have to memorize them. And I don't have to write them on a board. So he starts with the differentiation of self. This is the micro view. The ability to separate oneself intellectually and emotionally from their family of origin. People with higher differentiation can maintain a sense of self while remaining emotionally connected. People with a lower differentiation don't differentiate themselves, but identify themselves with the family, what we call ego mass. So the dysfunction of the family becomes who they are. This, as you can imagine, could be very problematic. So, yeah. So differentiation of self, meaning that you can identify yourself without identifying yourself specifically with the family. You have your own emotional intelligence, your own emotional life that is not connected with the family. Now, it doesn't mean that it didn't come from the family. It just means that you are able to separate out from them and not be engulfed by them or absorbed by them. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm getting to that. No, most of us have some connection with our families that define who we are. None of us are so differentiated that we're disconnected from our families. That would be quite incredible. And I can imagine in a future world where we actually have our own systems where eggs are fertilized outside of the body and there's no connection with the human until you are born, that all of that might one day occur. But is it healthy? We don't necessarily think it is healthy. So those connections actually become very important. And he was also saying these connections are very important. That although we want a differentiated self, we want to be able to think, operate, and be emotionally separate from our families. We need that in order to become that separate person. That's what he was saying. So that was his first major concept. There are 8 concepts altogether. The second became incredibly popular. It's called triangles. It's when 2 people in a relationship experience tension. And to decrease that tension, they involve a third person to try to reduce that tension. Sometimes that third person volunteers themselves into that scenario to try to reduce the tension. There are families where we have what we call peacemakers that try to intervene between 2 family members that are at odds with each other. And there are families where the people that are in tension with each other try to pull people in to diffuse that tension. Now, he didn't necessarily think that this was a bad thing because what he thought was that the tension between those 2 people could destabilize an entire family. That having a third person come in and diffuse some of that tension might be helpful. Unless, of course, that third person is a destabilizing force and creates an even bigger rift. Stabilizing relationships, destabilizing relationships can be perpetuate dysfunction in a family, basically. So if you have one member of a family who comes in and causes what we like to call trouble, especially between family members, that person is a destabilizing partner in those relationships. I can think of I think I'm thinking of a family in particular where there's at least one member of a group of very large number of siblings who always seems to find herself in that role of the third leg of the stool. And she ends up being the go between back and forth between other siblings about what's happening and trying to create a more stable stool. They are learned behaviors, yes. They are totally learned behaviors. Right. Yeah. Yeah, Bowen thought they were all learned behaviors. That was his hypothesis. And you have to remember he was working with schizophrenic families, and so he's looking at generations of a family that produced a schizophrenic child and trying to understand what happened here. That's what he's doing. No, certainly not. But it's a very clear dysfunction that he could label. But you can see this also happening in other families where a third will step in to try to de-escalate tension between two. It's very similar to another theory where it gets labeled as triangulation, but in triangulation it involves a child. But that's not what this is. This could be a child, but it doesn't have to be. It can be siblings. It could be a spouse against two children, or two children against a parent. It could be any variety. And the triangles can grow exponentially. So let's start with you have two siblings that are fighting. They pull in a third sibling to try to de escalate what's going on. That third sibling can then go to yet another sibling, involve one of the original siblings, and create yet another triangle. What he says is that for the most part, this only creates confusion and doesn't help in furthering the relationship of the two that were initially in conflict with each other. They can help. I'm just getting to that. So, yeah. So not a lot of people have that many children to choose from anymore. So yeah, yeah. Does this then also extend to other more distant relatives absolutely that have more powerful presence in the family? Yes. And it can do the same thing among two children. Yeah, it can be two children. It can be a parent and an uncle or an aunt. It can be anybody. It could be a neighbor. Yeah, absolutely could be a neighbor, especially if the neighbor is considered pseudo family. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so the greater the fusion in the family, that is, the greater the intense bond that doesn't allow people to be individuals within the family, the greater the chances that this will happen. Meaning that if you have a family who talks specifically about family loyalty all the time, I'm thinking of one particular family where when there's family pictures taken, you're not family, get out of the picture, and they're talking to a spouse. That's the kind of family that creates this kind of situation where you start pulling in and becoming fused as a family. Now, why does fusion happen? There's a lot of different reasons why fusion happens, but it's often around feeling unstable and unable to fend for oneself in the world. And by creating this fusion, what one does is sort of create allies, even though they may not actually be allies. The, the thought is, that's my ally. We're going to have this bond, come hell or high water. And then that bond creates tension because the other person maybe doesn't even want the bond, or the bond is too much. Okay, so that's his idea of triangles, just pulling people into the conflict. The next concept is nuclear. Yeah, I do this all the time. I know how to say nuclear and nuclear, and I do it every time. I always like stumble over it. I know the difference. It's just a thing for me. So, nuclear family emotional systems. This is a pattern of emotional functioning, such as conflict dysfunction in a spouse or emotional distancing, and they're shaped by family members' levels of differentiation. The more a family member is separate from their family, differentiated, and not necessarily pulled in by their drama, the more tension that happens. It creates tension between the person that's differentiated, that's in a lot of terms we think of them as more mature, not getting involved in family conflict, pulling away. The more tension it creates between not only that person that's differentiated, but the people in the family who continue to try to pull that person in and keep them as part of the fused family unit. This can be pretty difficult for a lot of people, especially people who have gotten mentally healthy and try to separate from a unhealthy family, because there's a lot of pushback and a lot of jealousy that happens. People think, oh, you just don't want to be part of this family anymore. You're too good for us. And the healthy person's probably likely to say, well, no, that's not true. I want to be part of this family. And in their mind, they're thinking, I just don't want to be part of your crazy family stuff. And so there's a lot of tension in the family with a dysfunctional system to try to keep pulling people back to that conflict, that craziness that's going on. We see this all the time, especially when you send somebody off to be in a mental health facility and they come out of the mental health facility and have learned all sorts of great techniques to help themselves and make themselves a better person. Or you don't even have to go that extreme. If you go to your own individual family therapy and your therapist points out things to you and you go, that's not such a great idea to get involved in that kind of stuff, they up the ante. They try harder to reel you back in and keep you part of that fused mass. We call that fused family ego mass. It's not healthy for you. It's not healthy for them, but it's what they know and feels comforting and feels normal. It's what they love. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, I have some of that drama happening right now in my family where my dad has limited mobility, and so my brother, I'm the oldest, and which makes me more responsible by birth order. We'll get to that in a moment. And then my middle brother, who was sort of the lost child in all of this, and my younger brother, who is off living his life very independently of everybody else, and only on occasion dips in to see what's going on. Well, my middle brother's now living with my dad due to some marital issues. Um, my dad needs a lot of help and he needs a lot of interaction. And so I forgot now where I was headed with this. That kind of tension and fusion now between my dad and my brother has gotten kind of intense. And I've worked pretty hard to stay out of it, but I get these phone calls at least once a week about something that's not going well. Mostly from my dad, even though my brother happens to be sitting right next to him. Never do they call the other brother because he's separated out. He's completely cut himself off from this. Now, Bowen would say that's a terrible thing. I don't know if it's a terrible thing. It can be a very healthy thing. Yes, a flight into health. I just happen to live the closest to, from everybody, which is, and then I'm Italian and I'm the oldest female, so there you go. it's, yeah, it's my job by definition. Yeah, it is. It is. It's yes, totally different experience. Yeah, this is a very American experience. Yeah, and it really started very much in the 1950s. Now, it's also very cultural. It's white European. It's not anything else. No, it's just it's just us pale folks who think that we know better, and we don't. Um, but we also haven't figured out how to deal with this in a better way. Yes, the display is different. The manifestation of symptoms is actually different, but it is as prevalent. It's 1% of the population globally. We're pretty certain that it's a genetic anomaly that we can't pinpoint yet. Yeah, um, there is a theory about that. There's no proof of that yet. Yes, it was. Yes, it was a way to try to ditch the immigrant experience. That's what it was. I'm sorry? Yes, yes. Yeah, people wanted to identify as American. And so part of what happened was they moved out of these enclaves, really, of culture that they were brought up in. And it predominantly started in the 50s. Yes. Yeah, it created a lot of tension and a lot of singularity in terms of how we look at our lives. We don't necessarily, in particular, I'm going to speak only about white culture in particular. And I say white because that encompasses a number of different areas around the globe. But it's very individualistic. There's less community involvement, there's less family involvement, there's less interest in what's happening around you, typically. Um, we've gotten better at that, but in the 50s, that wasn't necessarily the case. 50s and 60s, yeah. Yes, you lose it. If you're not raised in multi generational family communities, you lose that sense of how to build community. No, you don't. We are. Yes. Yeah, sociologically speaking, which is not my field, I have to be honest about it. Um, the understanding is we built these church communities or community center communities specifically to deal with that loss of interconnectedness and family. Um, not to downplay the importance of the religious celebration and worship. That's not part of it. but the church became more than that. It became the extended family in many ways in these communities. And it actually became even more important part of communities where there was family, but the family had been disconnected from roots. So immigrant communities, for instance. Um, some, not all, but some African American communities, especially as people moved from areas where they were enslaved up north. This became an important part of rebuilding a family in a way where family wasn't there. Yes, right. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, that's the norm now, but it wasn't in the 50s, right? You didn't marry outside of your even cultural community. Well, interestingly enough, my own story is that my mom and dad, my mom was a Congregationalist, Welsh, and my dad was Roman Catholic. And the Roman Catholic Church insisted that number one, children would be raised Roman Catholic if they were allowed to get married, and number two, that the oh no, I lost my train of thought. Number two, that my mom would agree to raise us Catholic. That was it. Uh, yeah. They they allowed my parents to marry in the Roman Church. My mother did not agree to convert, but she agreed to raise the children Roman Catholic, um, which is kind of interesting because now we're all Protestant. Yeah, Anglo Catholics. I'm sort of the compromise in this. Okay, so the next one is a little bit tougher concept to understand. I'm up to number 4, right? Okay, good. I had a blip in my brain just now going, no coffee yet. That's what did it. No, I'm good. Family projection process. Um, I'm just going to read it as it's said here, and then I'm going to explain it. It says parents may project their own unresolved emotional issues onto a child, affecting the child's development and functioning. So it sounds easy to understand, but it's a little bit more complicated. So my dad had this thing about when he was growing up being called irresponsible. And he was irresponsible because he had ADHD and nobody knew what that was back then. And so what he ended up doing is calling each one of his kids as we were growing up irresponsible. And I have to tell you, I had this visceral reaction to it because I was the most responsible kid I knew. And I am not even kidding about that. I was such a rule follower. I was so on top of everything. I never forgot anything for school. My little brother had ADHD, and he was a nightmare. He was not responsible for anything. And guess what they did? They blamed me when he forgot his stuff for school. So I became responsible for him. And so this projection process was like, how could you let your brother forget to do this? I'm like, I am just trying to hold myself together. Like, that's what they're talking about here. It also, is things that my father struggled with. So he would forget things. Now, he worked for the government, and I like to say he just built tanks, bombs, and guns, which is actually true. That's what he did. But you have to enter a base with a badge, and if you forgot your badge, you had to go back and get your badge to get on base. They didn't just allow you on base, even if they knew who you were. You had to have your badge. And when he forgot uh, his badge, and showed up at the base, all hell would break loose that day because he was so angry and so upset, and everybody was irresponsible. Yes, he totally was doing that. And so that's what they're talking about. That projection of one's own stuff, especially onto children. And it happens more with children who are actually disabled. They get the bigger brunt of it. Why? Because they can't stand up for themselves and fend for themselves around these issues. So when my dad would call me irresponsible, um, I was the mouthy one that fought back. That was probably not a good thing to do. Eventually, I learned to say, "You're right, Dad, I'm irresponsible," and then go like mumble something under my breath as I walked away. My middle brother would always fight back, and that was not good because he and my dad clashed all the time. My little brother, who was the one with the problem, would say, "Yeah, you're right," and walk away. Guess who got out best? That one. That one got out best. Okay, multi-generational transmission process. Patterns, behaviors, and emotional functioning and levels of differentiation are passed down through the generations. What does that mean? It means that if you're enmeshed or over involved with your parents, you and your kids are likely to be over involved with each other, and so on and so on. Breaking that cycle can be a really important thing to do. Recognizing it first is the hard thing to do. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes. Yes, it is. Because let's say you've got a parent who is, let's say they have bipolar disorder, for instance, because we know that bipolar disorder specifically is something that's genetic. We know that. So the kids develop behaviors to deal with that bipolar parent. And then when they go off and have their own children, those specific coping mechanisms aren't necessarily needed anymore. So what they end up doing is still using them, even with the environment with the well kids. But one of the things we know about bipolar disorder is that it is actually a genetic issue. So it then shows up in the next generation. And the kids who were raised by the parent who were dealing with their own bipolar parent now have this idea that, whoa, all of this stuff doesn't really apply to me. And then when they have their own kid with bipolar disorder, they actually don't know how to do this because they've swung the pendulum the other way and are reacting as if this is a normal kid. And this is a problem because it's hard to convince them that they have to change because they didn't like what they went through growing up. It's a difficult situation. So Bowen also talked about emotional cutoffs, which is on the back of your first page there. So when people attempt to manage unresolved family issues by reducing or cutting off relationships with their parents and or other family members, which can paradoxically actually maintain emotional entanglement. Now, while He felt that staying in the family and trying to work that out was the best possible solution. I actually disagree with him, and most modern psychologists disagree with him. They don't think that's the best way to do it. That's separating out, understanding what happened, and then re-entering the family in a way that's healthy and easier to manage is the best way to handle it. Unfortunately for those folks, what often happens is that the folks that have separated out ended up being pariahs in their family. Their people get jealous of them. You have your own life. You don't really care about us. You don't care about what's happening. You don't know what I'm putting up with. There's a lot of that happens. And even if they try to encourage their siblings to do the same thing, it ends up being seen as like, oh, you think you know better. And that's not helpful. Um, so I'm an advocate for cutting off from a family when it's toxic and trying to recenter your life and then living your life as best as possible without feeling drawn back into that. Because I think that can be even worse to end up back in the mix even after you've separated out because they haven't changed. You've changed, but they haven't changed. He was Bowen was a big fan of birth order and how that played in. He was looking at Walter Toman's work that was happening at the same time about birth order and the role that plays in the roles we get assigned in our family. I, of course, am the responsible one. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, that too. Yeah, I was. I always call it. I'm the first one's the experimental child. Yes, and it's worse is in my family because I'm the only girl. So not only am I the experimental child, but I also had to suffer the I don't have any female siblings to compare to. So and of course, being raised in the 60s and 70s, there were very specific things that were allowed for boys and not allowed for girls. And yeah, that was a little tough. I still remember going off to college, being the first to go off to college. My parents sat me down and said, there is this amount of money for the three of you to go to college. Now, I'm going to back this up because I knew I was the smart one. and I'm like, and I'm like, okay, I get that there's this amount of money. And my father said, I don't want you to go off to college just to get married. If you're looking to find a guy to get married, there's another way to do that. And in my brain, I went, yeah, that's not happening. I didn't say anything. I went, uh huh, okay. So for them, it was really about making sure that my brothers got to go to college because they were the guys and they were going to be the breadwinners in their families. You know, remember this is the 60s. This is what they were thinking. 60s, early 70s. So this is where their heads are. That they needed to prepare my brothers to make sure that they could support a family. Hmm. Yeah, right. They needed to get a job. Yeah. Ah. Yeah. Well, you were very lucky and progressive. Yeah. 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 It did depend on the family. So, yeah, we were lower middle class and there was a finite amount of money. Yeah. Yeah. Um Yes. Yeah. So actually, this is probably he really drew on Toman's work. The oldest is going to be more responsible. Oh yeah. 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 We were to be more responsible. I'm the oldest. We were to be more responsible. The younger ones typically got babied, even beyond when it should have stopped. It was just part of the process. There's a lot of he was a sociologist, Toman, so there's a lot of information about his work, which I won't go into here. It's very hard, right? Because it's not only birth order; it comes birth order and gender, and the expectations based on gender become very specific too. Um, okay, societal emotional process. So we've sort of taken now, we've started at the very beginning where we were looking at the individual and we're zooming out now to the family and now out to society. Emotional functioning in society perils the emotional functioning or the emotional family process, particularly in response to stress and anxiety. So this was probably his least developed concept. But the concept really makes a lot of sense if you think about it, especially now that we've had some ups and downs emotionally in a society. So, what he was saying is things like you've got a family. Let's say there is a mom and dad and three kids. We'll just start there because that was my family. And the mom and dad are both working because that's how they're putting food on the table for three kids and providing other things that those children need. A recession happens or a big change in government. My dad worked for the government, so that's an easy one to go by. And now, all of a sudden, people are getting laid off. So dad gets laid off. Mom is working in another industry, but that industry is also affected by the recession. So now it's becoming much harder to put food on the table and take care of the kids. Dad's getting laid off. He's not sure where he's going to go, what's going to happen, how he's going to take care of his family. All his insecurities are bubbling to the top, thinking, am I really fit to have a family at this point? Mom is struggling, trying to make up for whatever's not happening with dad emotionally with the kids, and trying to take care of dad at the same time. Tension starts to happen in the house. Mom and dad are fighting over little things. Why did you buy that popcorn? That's ridiculous. We don't need popcorn. We need food. Little things like that start to crop up. The kids are feeling that pressure and feeling what's going on. And so now they're reacting to their parents. Maybe that the kids are avoiding dad because dad's in a bad mood. Maybe they're afraid to ask for something that they need for school because they know money's tight. Let's focus now on the oldest one. The oldest one becomes a perfectionist, trying to make things calm and even and steady going so that there's no upset in the house. The youngest one starts acting out because they're not getting the same attention that they used to get. And so they're doing things that cause the parents to both come together and try to deal with the youngest one's behavior. And the middle one is feeling somewhat lost. That was what he was talking about, that the society, what's happening in our society, what's happening in the world around us actually affects the family system and how this gets played out. And while it's the least developed, he's probably the most right about that one. Um, it is pretty demonstrable because we can see that just by watching what happens in our school systems and watching how that plays out in communities. So, in a nutshell, those were his 8 positions. And while there's no extensive research on this, there's a lot of anecdotal information that says he was right. He was right about a lot of this. Um, Again, I'm not so sure about the cutoff thing. I think that sometimes cutting off from a family can be an important emotional step. and allow for growth and individuation. Um, Questions on this part? Yeah. Not all of it. Uh, yeah. There are some personality disorders that cutoff becomes an important part of why the personality disorder develops. But it's not an absolute. This is why. Yeah. It's a multifaceted uh, problem. Yeah. It often develops because there's dysfunction in the family to begin with in mental health issues. Um, and that's usually where it comes from. That's a tough question to answer. I think it really boils down to I don't have any numbers for this. What I have is personal experience. It's usually not till a crisis is reached that anything gets talked about. Um, that is the bottom line. If you think about our own lives, I was just thinking about my life yesterday because I was a little under the weather. I have allergies. I also think I'm getting a sinus infection, which is why I'm more nasal than usual. But in the process of it, I was just thinking about my own life and my own family and how, as I'm watching things unfold, I'm starting to relate to my dad, who felt entirely overwhelmed and terribly busy. So he worked 40 hours a week. Sometimes he worked more when there was a huge project they were trying to launch. And he worked on some really huge weapons for the US government. So when that tension was really intense, and he wouldn't focus on what was going on in the family. He was trying to find time for himself, trying to find a way to like keep his own sanity. And so he would sort of separate out. And it's only, pulling the lens way back as an adult can I see this going on. And so he would find things like getting involved with Little League to give himself a respite and totally pulling back from the family and totally separating out. And it wasn't until my brother Raymond had an issue, he's the middle guy, that it pulled him back in. And it was pretty clear to me that everybody saw, hindsight's 2020, looking back, everybody saw something was wrong. Everybody recognized there was a problem. And it would come down to my father trying to use discipline to correct the problem, my mother trying to say everything will pass, and the other two kids, me and my younger brother, just trying to live our lives so we didn't get caught up in whatever was happening in the house. It took the crisis to get that perspective and be able to take care of the problem. Bye. Yeah. Uh, Okay, so it's the diagnostic manual for mental health disorders. I don't remember the date that it's developed. I actually have that in my notes because I teach that class. Uh, it's one of I have to be honest. I have dyslexia, and one of the things I don't memorize is dates typically because I just transpose dates all the time. Yeah. It was earlier than that actually. Yeah, and it was developed specifically. The diagnostic manual was developed specifically for use, not in diagnosing people, but for standardizing research, so that when everybody said, "Oh, I'm working with depressive patients," they all had a definition of depressive patients, and it came from that manual. And now it seems to have become the book that gets you paid if you're a clinician. You put the right code in, you get paid for the disorder. Um, not the greatest use of the book. But was there a second part of that? Oh, yeah. We're on five TR text revision. Yeah. Well, so there's different levels of being cut off, right? Um, I know a family where a lot of the members don't speak to each other, but they will show up at a family dinner and they will politely say hello and they may ask how each other's children are doing, but they still don't engage with each other. So they are emotionally cut off from each other, but not necessarily physically cut off from each other. And so that is a pretty common factor. The trick is if you re-engage with a family where there is major dysfunction, is to not get pulled back into the dysfunction. And I think you have to be pretty practiced at not at your own core beliefs and values and asserting them in order not to get pulled back in. Um, and yes, the idea was exposure to somebody who has individuated and become their own person could be healthy for other family members. What the research is currently saying is not for the immediate family members. It's for the next generation. It's That's where it is. So let's say, it's I'm cut off from my family. It's my nieces and nephews and my own children that would benefit from that. Yeah. Yes, they see it as an option. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, it also depends on, let's say if it's a teenager like that, it depends on the emotional maturity of that teenager. It may take years before they're emotionally mature enough to not feel overwhelmed or engulfed by the family, to live a particular way and to act a particular way. So I think that that's important too. An older person may integrate back more easily. The trick is to not get pulled back into the same cycle of problem that created you that forced you to move out of it to begin with. Right. Right. Yes. 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 It is. Yeah. Right. Well, we know there is some sort of genetic anomaly. We just can't pinpoint it, but it is a coping mechanism because every symptom is a reaction to a stressor. It doesn't mean that the person would be completely and totally normal without medication, um, or without stress, because that's not true either. But remember that stressors can be external or internally generated. We generate our own stressors. They come in forms of self-talk, like everybody hates me, or the world is falling apart and I'm not going to have anywhere to hide, or whatever it is. We can generate our own, and the more we generate, the more chaotic our coping mechanisms can be. Yeah. Yeah. You got it. Okay. So this is tricky because what we found in twins that were separated at birth, they use the same coping mechanism. So we don't really know. Um, we do know that environment does play a role, but we don't know how much. Uh, it's a very tricky thing. Genetics plays a bigger role than we think. We are genetically predisposed to deal with anxiety in a particular way. So I used to watch this show when it was on Animal Planet. It was called Meerkat Manor. Loved the show. There was always the meerkat who was responsible for looking out for the whole colony. He'd be up there like, that's me. I am the active scanner for things in the environment. And genetically, my mother did the same thing. And I know that. And her mother, she said, did the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. Just handed down. Yeah. Yes. And we're going to start now. Yeah, probably 20 minutes. Yep. Yep. All right. I'm going to give you some papers because you don't have them yet. Wait, turn this off so it doesn't make it. So what you have in front of you, turn to the page that says Genogram Analytics at the top. I do not have stock in this company. Just need to let you know that. It's a common thing that I say when I do my class at Montclair State. These are standard symbols for genograms, and the reason I have this board is because this was made in 2007, and there have been some symbols that have been added, and I want to go over those really quick. So the first, let's just go across the top, and then you'll have an opportunity to take a moment and roughly start to sketch your own genogram. So a genogram was a tool developed by Murray Bowen to help in talking to families about what's going on in their family. He also used it because people tend to hide things when they talk about their families in therapy, not necessarily on purpose. The stuff they don't want to talk about that's uncomfortable, they tend to just not talk about. And so he found a way to do this by just making a graph of it that allowed him to ask questions and to be a little bit more clear about things and to start to look for patterns in families. And so he starts with these standard symbols at the top. You see the square is the male and the circle is the female. And then you have lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. That's not entirely true anymore. That's only lesbian and gay. Gay men is a triangle, a square with a triangle inside. A lesbian or gay female is a circle with a triangle inside. The new symbols. This is a trans male. Oh, I missed. Now you're seeing my dyslexia. My N didn't come out there. Outside presentation male, inside genetically born female. Trans female. Outside presentation is female, genetically born male. Now, it's not required that somebody put that there. It's if they choose to put that there to identify as such, then they are allowed to do that. This would be a gay male. This is lesbian. Squares are men, circles are women. Don't ask me why, I really don't know. Then, oops, yep. So this is bisexual. Outward presenting male, bisexual. Outward presenting female, bisexual. And this is non-binary. Doesn't identify as male or female. No circle, no square, upside down triangle. I'm sorry, this is, let me just move this out of the way and you can see it a little bit better. There are a lot of secrets. What's often the telltale is who they're living with. Who they're living with is usually the telltale sign. Right. So typically when we do this, we put the age inside the symbol. So you would put your age inside the symbol. The other way to do this is simply put a birth date and if there's a death date next to that at the top. You can see this all on the top line of standard symbols for genograms. And by the way, this comes from Genogram Analytics, a company that does you can do your genogram online. And then you have to pay for it. Index person, that would be you. If you identify as male, then it's a square inside of a square. If you identify as female, it's a circle inside a circle. As you identify as any of one of these, then it's whatever the outward circle is. You make an or square, you put another one on top of that, and that's it. So down here in a triangle, it would be a triangle in a triangle. And that indicates that that's you. Marriages are a bracket. You'll see on that second line, we have a bracket of a heterosexual marriage, a man and a woman. And typically, just because this is how it was developed, men are usually put on the left, women are put on the right. It actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Sometimes when you're doing a genogram, if you're one family's larger than the other, you usually start with that just because it's easier to make the space. Living together is another bracket, or an affair, actually. It's a dotted bracket. It's not a legal binding relationship. We can also use that bracket if you're just dating somebody. If you don't have a pencil and you want to take notes, there's some pencils up here. Pass those around. You'll notice at the bottom of these, there is a marriage date or living together date. That's what LT stands for. On the third line, if you go in, on the third line, you'll see, I'm sorry, on both of those lines, there's, on the third line down, on the first one, there's a hash. That means that there's a separation. They're taking a break. A double hash line means that there's a divorce. And then if you put a line through those double hash lines, it means they got back together. I try to think of everything. So you'll notice there's a box in the next one with a line and notice it's a straight line. A straight line or even a dotted line that doesn't have a bracket is a relationship. It's not a romantic relationship, it's just a relationship. Brackets are considered a pairing, a romantic relationship. So that bracket to a house or institution is, for instance, in my family, I teach at Montclair State. My brother David graduated from Montclair State. We would both have a dashed line to an institution, Montclair State. Because they're patterns that develop. So, for instance, we get to the next one. It's a triangle, a right side up triangle, different than the upside down triangle. So the right side up triangle indicates a profession. In my family, my dad's sister, Margie, was a nurse. Actually, she worked in the OR. She was an OR nurse. My mom was a nurse. Her sister-in-law, my uncle's wife, was a nurse. My wife is a nurse. Nursing runs in our family. All of them there would have been a line to nursing as a profession. There are 2 psychologists and a social worker in my family, on my mother's side of the family. We would all have a line to that mental health institution. When you start to do this for your own family, you're going to start to see patterns emerging. And not just like these kinds of patterns, but other things. So for instance, I like to joke about this with my class. And okay, this is a true confession time. I am a big believer in the existence of Bigfoot. Ask my wife, she'll tell you. She finds this very amusing that I will watch pretty much any Bigfoot episode on TV. And she reminds me every time I put it on that if it was really true, they would have reported it on the 6 o'clock news, which which also is probably true, but I have seen news stories about Bigfoot, so hey, you never know. Um, it's not only me that believes this. My dad believes this. My uncle believes this. My yeah, you can you can actually, and this is what I'm glad you asked because this is what I was getting to. You can make your own symbols. So yes, I would use the Bigfoot running as the symbol for that. We're also everyone in my family played my family of origin played an instrument, and pretty much everybody in my extended family played instruments. So there are other things that you can track besides these kinds of specific institutional things. Yeah, you talk to people. You got to talk to people. Yes. Yes. They wouldn't have thought of it as being important. Yes. So the next line down is how you would lay out a family. Of course, this is a very large family and completely and totally made up so that you could see all the possible symbols here. So children are listed left to right with the oldest one first and the youngest one last. And we have going across that line, biological child, you'll see that they're 33. Again, this is off the bracket. And in there, inside the bracket is the age because there's no death date, just to make it easier to see. A foster child, instead of a straight line, it's a dotted line. An adopted child is a dotted line plus the straight line, meaning that it is a legal relationship. A stillbirth, this is a stillbirth where we know the gender was male. They made it a very tiny square with an X through it. An X through anything means that the person has passed away. A miscarriage, this was a miscarriage knowing that it was a female. There's a tiny O there or a circle. Abortion with an X, meaning that they did not know the gender of that embryo. Fraternal twins. Fraternal twins come off one point on the parental line and split down into two. Identical twins do the same thing, except there is a bar between their lines. So if you'll notice, the identical twins, right where it says 1985, there's a bar right above it. That means they were born in 1985, and that bar means that they're identical. A pregnancy where the child's gender is unknown is a triangle. There are ways to indicate patterns of mental health issues happening in families, alcohol abuse, and this is, you'll have to excuse this is probably photocopied about a zillion times now. The bottom half of the symbol is shaded. You can do that with squares or circles. Suspected abuse is a not a fully shaded line, but just lines through that section. In recovery, you're still cutting the symbol in half, but now 3/4 of it is clear. Serious mental health issues, they go on the sides. Typically on the left side, if it's a serious mental health issue plus substance abuse, 3/4 of the symbol gets shaded. You can also indicate the relationship between people. A positive relationship is a straight line between those people. Notice there's no bracket. Bracket indicates a romantic relationship. A distant relationship is a dashed line. An overly close relationship, or just, I should say close, not overly close, that comes up next. A very close relationship is two straight lines between that person. No, it could be a positive. Yeah, I'm getting to that. There's close and hostile. Hostile has a wavy line between them. Focused on often comes up when we have a disabled child, and it often is sadly just one parent is overly focused on the child. Um, can also come up with there is somebody that you're taking care of in the family, like a parent that also lives in the family. Fused. Fused means that you are enmeshed. Those are three lines together. Hostile. Hostile is a squiggly line. Hostile directed. This is often usually a parent to a child, a parent being hostilely focused on one child. Fused and hostile, this is bad. This is very bad when you're fused and hostile, meaning that you're in a very intense relationship and you tend to be hostile with each other. Anybody see, it's very old now, but Grey Gardens, the movie Grey Gardens? Edie and little Edie, that's them, fused and hostile. They had their good moments. Doesn't mean you don't have good moments. I'll help you with that in a moment. We're almost there. A cutoff. Sometimes you cut somebody out of your life. That's that symbol. And physical or sexual abuse. Notice the difference between hostile. It is much more intense squiggly line, and the triangle is colored in to indicate that this was an abusive relationship. Okay, on the back. I always give this to my classes because I think it's just fun. This is Freud's genogram. Yeah, wow indeed. So to find Sigmund, we need a double square. If you look to find Sigmund, you'll see him not in the first generation or the second generation or the third generation. He's in the fourth generation here. And you'll see him on the left-hand side. And he's got a squiggly line to a Catholic nursemaid. He was really mad at that Catholic nursemaid because she stole from the family. He had her jailed and arrested and jailed. Yeah, and you'll see that the Catholic nursemaid had a mental health disorder. That's what that is. Sigmund was married to Martha. We'll start with his family, his direct family. He had Matilda, Martin, Oliver, Ernest, Sophia, and Anna. And I want you to notice the very positive line between him and Anna. Anna became the heir of his theory and went on to try to perpetuate this. Unfortunately, Melanie Klein eclipsed her and she just kind of fell off the face of the earth, but she talked mostly about coping mechanisms, Anna. Anna was the pride and joy of his life. Sigmund was married to Martha. He also had an affair with Martha's sister, Mima. So look next to Martha, and you that dotted line. He had an affair with her sister. Sigmund was a bad boy. Mina has another love interest, which is that little square there with an X. He did get caught, by the way, just FYI. Does everybody see them? It's Mima. Mima. She had another affair. Inconsequential to Freud. That's why it's smaller. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It would be directly connected to Martha as opposed to. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 His youngest daughter after his sister, who then also tries to live up to the expectations of her dad by entering the field that he chose. The field that he chose. So Anna Freud becomes a a psychiatrist in her own right. I think it probably was just too unwieldy for the for the document. That's what I think. So why am I showing you this? Because I think you can learn a lot from these things. Not just where the pathology is, although that is incredibly helpful. Um, because one of the things that Bowen thought, which is why he set this up, is that it took 3 generations to produce pathology. That's what he thought. And he thought that individuation, when we marry somebody of similar individuation, what happens then is if we create a hostile environment in that partnership, then our children are even less individuated than we were. And then beyond that, they marry somebody who's of similar individuation, and then they create somebody who's even less individuated than they were. So it took 3 generations, according to Bowen, to create dysfunction. That's what he thought. Yeah, well, to create disruptive dysfunction. He assumed that we were all dysfunctional. uh, he didn't say. So what I'd like you to do, you don't have to do it now, although because we are starting to run a little late, is start to like lay out your family. Start with your own current family, your nuclear family, and then lay out your kids, grandkids, and then go back generations and start to see if there are patterns here. You're looking for the patterns. Patterns will repeat themselves, not just in the good things, not in the bad things, but also in the good things. So, in my family of origin, I didn't really know my mom's parents very well because they died when my mom was 5 when her mother died, and then I was like less than 5, probably 2 when my grandfather died, her father. So I didn't get to see a lot of that side of the family, and I didn't realize that a lot of the things that I do really are more genetically supported on my mom's side of the family, because I had only known my father's side of the family, and I was very curious. I always felt like, why don't I fit on this side of the family? And doing this in graduate school started to make a lot of sense to me. Like, oh, so there are the people who teach in college. Oh, there are the people that are interested in the humanities. Oh, there are the people that do this and that and some other thing. So start to include some of these things for yourself. You'll start to do more of this in the genealogy classes, but it's a good head start to just lay this out. And if you're having trouble making it happen, I'm around. Call me. I like this stuff. It's fun for me. Um, and I will be happy to help you sort of figure it out. It's not terribly hard, but some of the things were, by the way, every therapist and psychologist and counselor and social worker has to do this in grad school. It's a requirement. I still have mine, by the way. Um, it was probably the first time that I recognized that where some of these things come from in my family, where some of these patterns originated. And they weren't what I thought, which was surprising. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Everybody on my mother's side of the family has an allergy. Everybody. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You color code it. You can create your own symbols even to color code it. Yeah. That's the cool part about this is you can create your own symbols. In fact, all my students do this as part of their graduate work in my marriage and family class. Well, I hope it was more. I hope it was fun. I mean, yeah, I I know I didn't even offer food. I mean, I think that's amazing. I had all these people I didn't even offer food. Yeah.